This is the Cortex Athletic Review. I'm your host, Evan Carrillo, and each week I dive into the research to distill and relate sports science and psychological peer-reviewed literature to modern-day coaching and athletic development with a slight bias to hockey goaltenders.
Explain sleep to an alien that doesn't sleep. I couldn't do it. I could explain food. I could be like, I need energy, so I eat an apple so I can use the energy that's in the apple. They'd be like, okay. Anything else? At night? Regardless of how much energy I've consumed, I just have to shut it down. I shut it down for like 8, 9, sometimes 12 hours. Sounds boring. I'm like, no, my brain plays movies that I'm in.
That was comedian Pete Holmes. I thought he did a pretty good job of summing up the total weirdness of sleep and why we need to spend a third of our lives in this totally unaware, unconscious state. Sleep is also the most ironic element of athletic performance, in the sense that the better you do sleep, the higher the potential performance correlation. But doing sleep better isn't an active thing that you can just put more effort into. If anything, it's kind of the opposite. Like if you want to jump higher, well, just put more effort into the act of jumping. Want to sleep better? Then get yourself in the most relaxed and least energetic state possible. Like, it's just completely backwards. The research this week explores whether a simple sleep hygiene intervention as short as 14 days could measurably influence sleep quality, athletic performance, and anticipatory cortisol responses in university soccer players. I'll unpack all of that a little bit later on. More broadly, though, I think it pushes us towards viewing sleep less as this thing that just happens after training at the end of our day, and more as a part of training itself. The article this week is titled, "A 14-Day Sleep Hygiene Intervention Improves Aerobic Performance and Reduces Anticipatory Cortisol in University Soccer Players." It was published in the journal Sports Science in April of 2026 and was written by Adele Brudrick and Retief Brudrick out of the Physical Activity, Sport, and Recreation Research Focus area at Northwest University in South Africa. They looked at 30 university-level soccer players, male and female, and explored whether a relatively simple 14-day sleep hygiene intervention could measurably influence sleep quality, which in turn would influence aerobic performance, sprint performance, fatigue responses, and anticipatory cortisol levels before testing. This was intentionally practical and not something done in a lab or under rather unrealistic circumstances and conditions. The athletes stayed in their normal home environments and were asked to implement at least 10 out of 18 possible sleep hygiene behaviors consistently over a 2-week span. Things like limiting screen exposure before bed, controlling bedroom temperature and lighting, avoiding caffeine after a certain time of day, maintaining a more consistent sleep schedule, minimizing noise and stimulation, basic things, but intentionally basic here. I think there's sometimes this assumption in sports science that meaningful performance changes require extremely advanced interventions, and this paper is exploring whether small environmental and behavioral adjustments might already be enough to shift athlete recovery and physiological readiness in measurable and meaningful ways. Interventions that we already all have access to for the most part. The authors weren't necessarily interested in soccer players alone for this study. That's just how the participants ended up working out in this case. The specific focus was university athletes, what the paper calls dual career athletes. Essentially, full-time students balancing a full academic course load with full athletic training and performance schedules. As someone who's lived that for longer than I would care to admit, It's kind of a perfect storm for chronically poor recovery due to terrible sleep and sleep habits. It's common to have early morning practices or workouts, yet late games. At times, a fair bit of travel, and this is where this coursework is often tackled on the bus or the plane. 21st century athletes are on screens way later on into the night. Stress peaks and dips at different times in a semester, in midterm season, or at the end of a semester with finals and projects. And that doesn't even account for the, let's call it, social obligations of being a student athlete in college or university. It's basically a lifestyle that really fights against any kind of stable sleep behavior. The authors point out that soccer itself is already physiologically demanding because of the physical stress it puts on the body, both aerobic and anaerobic systems, so short bursts plus a lot of just running. Players might cover 10 to 12 kilometers in a match, but layered inside that are repeated high intensity efforts like sprinting, cutting, accelerating, stopping, changing direction, jumping, all this stuff. So it puts a fair bit of stress on the body, and right away, this recovery matters even more. But the paper also makes another distinction that I think is pretty important and kind of overlooked in a lot of student athlete conversations around sleep. They argue that sleep duration and sleep quality are not the same thing. When athletes talk about sleep, it usually gets reduced down to hours. So, how many hours of sleep did you get last night? What time did you go to bed? And what time did your alarm wake you up in the morning? But the authors here point out that technically you can get enough hours of sleep and still have really poor quality sleep. And that's just due to things like how long it takes to fall asleep and how often your sleep is disrupted, maybe some environmental disturbances, or even how rested the athlete just subjectively feels. So, this paper is not just asking, do the athletes end up sleeping more? No, it's asking something a little bit deeper. That's, could relatively small changes in sleep behavior alter the physiological state the athlete enters performance in? It becomes especially important once cortisol enters the discussion. If you asked me before reading this, what is cortisol, I would have given the same answer that a lot of people would, just minimized it down to it's the stress hormone. In reality, though, the authors point out it's much more involved in energy regulation and recovery and arousal and just overall readiness. The authors explain that poor sleep quality and insufficient sleep have both been linked to elevated cortisol responses, especially before exercise. In other words, what this means is before the athlete even starts moving, the body might already be entering the session in a more stressed physiological state. So, the actual intervention done for the study was pretty straightforward, at least on paper, anyways. The athletes went through a 14-day sleep hygiene intervention protocol, or SHIP, as people in academics do, is just give something an acronym, where they were asked to consistently follow at least 10 out of a possible 18 sleep supportive behaviors every day while continuing to live normally in their home environments. Again, this was not a lab study where researchers locked people in sleep chambers and monitored every single breath that they took and hooked them up to all these electrodes and stuff. The athletes, they were still students, still training, still living their normal lives. The goal here was to see whether realistic behavioral adjustments could still meaningfully influence recovery and performance. And this recovery and performance was attributed to better sleep. Some of these 18 possible sleep supported behaviors were the following: limiting electronic use before bed, switching screens to cooler light settings, reducing bedroom lighting at night, cooling the room temperature, avoiding caffeine later in the day, avoiding large meals close to bedtime, taking warm showers before bed, using eye masks or earplugs, maintaining a more fixed sleep routine, or limiting long or late naps during the day. Nothing here is particularly revolutionary. I think we would all probably be able to come up with a pretty similar list. But the neat thing is, that's actually partly the point. The paper is almost arguing that recovery quality might emerge from the accumulation of small environmental and behavioral factors that interact together rather than just from one magical intervention. I think what lacks with a lot of people is just this checklist mentality, and intention just isn't really there. Like, I myself know all of these things are important sleep hygiene things, but yet once in a while I'll find myself scrolling while I'm laying in bed or having a snack late at night or something like that. But back to this idea of, like, it's not research that's going to produce this magic sleep bullet. The researchers actually analyzed this idea statistically later on in the paper. So instead of treating all 18 sleep behaviors as separate, independent things, they grouped them into larger behavioral clusters. So these clusters were categories that were things like light and device management, or environmental control, or stimulant and nutritional regulation. And that actually makes a little bit more sense because in real life, these behaviors don't happen independently. So an athlete staying up late scrolling on their phone probably also has more light exposure and more cognitive stimulation, and thus more delayed sleep onset, potentially a more irregular routine overall. Human behavior over time just tends to cluster like this. So the researchers after that tested the athletes both before and after the intervention using a couple different metrics. I won't go too deep into what these statistical metrics were, but I'll list them here for those interested. The first was something called the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index, and that's essentially a standardized questionnaire that measures different dimensions of sleep quality. They also had two physical performance tests. One is called a yo-yo intermittent recovery test, and this is designed to assess repeated aerobic recovery capacity, as well as the repeated anaerobic sprint test, which looks more at repeated sprint ability and fatigue during really, really high intensity efforts. And last, the athletes provided saliva samples before testing so researchers could measure anticipatory cortisol levels. That anticipatory part here is actually an important detail. So the researchers were not measuring cortisol after exercise, they were measuring the hormonal stress response before the athlete even started the test. So, all that kind of summed up in really simple terms, the researchers were trying to see, does improving sleep hygiene change the condition the athletes show up in before performance? The first thing the researchers found is that, well, the intervention did improve sleep. To me and to everybody else, that probably seems pretty obvious, but it still does matter because a lot of recovery interventions in sport either don't really produce measurable changes, or if they do, the effects are really, really small. Or if you do get a meaningful effect, it relies heavily on athlete perception rather than an objective shift. In this case, after just 2 weeks or 14 days, the athletes in the trial showed statistically significant improvements in several of these sleep measures. So the sleep duration increased, sleep latency decreased, and sleep latency is just that period where you shut your light off and try to fall asleep. That period of trying to fall asleep was much, much shorter. And overall sleep quality scores improved quite a bit throughout the study. Before the intervention, only 8 of the 30 athletes were classified as good sleepers, according to the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. After the intervention, that number was up to 13, while the number of moderate poor sleepers dropped from 8 athletes down to just 1. So already the intervention appears to be meaningfully changing recovery behavior in a pretty short time window. The female athletes were the more interesting group. Before the intervention, the women in the study were sleeping less than the men on average, but after the intervention, they showed particularly strong improvements in sleep duration. So the length of sleep in an evening. The male athletes in this study improved more noticeably in sleep latency, essentially how quickly, again, they were able to fall asleep once their head hit the pillow. This is where the paper stays fairly restrained and careful not to jump to too many conclusions. The authors don't suddenly jump to women need more sleep or men sleep differently. They mostly frame these findings as evidence that sleep interventions might interact somewhat differently across the sexes because it's very much regulated by hormonal and physiological and behavioral differences that were discussed earlier in the paper. From there, the study moved into the physical performance testing, and this is where things got even more interesting and maybe even a little bit less intuitive, a little bit less of what you thought would think would happen. Because if I asked most athletes beforehand, what would happen if you improved your sleep quality for 2 weeks? Most people would probably predict something along the lines of I would be faster, my endurance would be better, my energy would be higher, better outputs across the board. Weirdly enough, though, that's not exactly what happened here. The aerobic findings were pretty clear. So, after the sleep intervention, the athletes performed better on this yo yo intermittent recovery test. They completed more shuttles and demonstrated improved intermittent endurance performance overall. This improvement showed up in both the male and the female athletes. So, at least from an aerobic standpoint, the intervention appears to be working. But the anaerobic sprint findings were where the paper became a little bit more interesting, maybe a little bit muddier. Some of the repeated sprint performances actually became slightly slower following the intervention, particularly in the female athletes. Sorry, ladies. At first glance, it sounds a little bit contradictory. I mean, how would better sleep produce slower sprint times? It feels kind of backwards. But this is where the authors in the paper take a more nuanced physiological turn instead of just assuming better recovery automatically means better at everything. The athletes demonstrated improved fatigue index scores following the intervention, and that just means while peak sprint outputs dipped a little bit, they were able to maintain their performance more consistently across repeated efforts, across repeated trials. The authors propose an interesting attempt at an explanation for this. They suggest that improved sleep may have shifted the athletes towards a more parasympathetic dominant physiological state. That sounds a lot more complicated than what it actually means, but in simplest terms, think of your nervous system like a constant balancing act between activation and recovery. The sympathetic side is associated more with arousal and stress and adrenaline, explosiveness, fight or flight type activation, despite the name sympathetic. The parasympathetic side is more associated with like recovery and regulation and calming and energy conservation and the physiological restoration. I just think of like a really wispy yoga instructor trying to calm everybody down at the end of the class or something. The authors essentially suggest that improving sleep quality might have enhanced recovery regulation and fatigue resistance while slightly dampening the acute high arousal state sometimes associated with this maximal sprint output. So, in other words, the fighting side of your nervous system after a really good sleep is just kind of being throttled down a little bit more, is what they're suggesting. I don't really know what to do with that from a performance standpoint. And it is still a really neat idea because it challenges the really simple assumption that recovery interventions just increase all forms of performance equally. But this study may have shown that different performance qualities might depend on slightly different physiological states. Being maximally recovered may not be exactly the same thing as being maximally activated. And this apparently appears to be most true in the explosive high arousal activities like sprinting. There might be a broader coaching implication hiding inside this finding, too. And I'm cautious to go here just because this is going to be such a small thing and not a detail that coaches are likely to just kind of activate and attribute to this. A lot of modern sport culture constantly pushes athletes toward higher activation. So, more stimulation, more adrenaline, more intensity, more hype, more caffeine, more nitrous, more sympathetic drive. But this paper suggests that there may also be performance value in physiological regulation, efficiency, controlled recovery states, particularly when fatigue resistance and repeatability with a task starts to matter. Now, remember, there were cortisol implications with this too, and the cortisol findings support this interpretation, actually. Remember those saliva samples that the researchers collected before the athletes did the tests? They weren't looking at how stressed the athletes became during the exercise. They were looking at the anticipatory stress response, and that just means before the work even started. Following the sleep intervention, anticipatory cortisol levels were consistently lower before both aerobic and anaerobic tests. What this means is the athletes appeared to be entering the testing environment in a calmer physiological state. And this doesn't mean lazy or unprepared or even lower energy. It just means physiologically they were less stressed than before exertion even began. This matters for the study because cortisol itself is not bad. We actually need cortisol. It plays a major role in energy availability and alertness and readiness. The issue with cortisol, as I'm sure a lot of us have heard, is that chronic cortisol elevation or dysregulation is where things start to get bad. The authors go on to explain that this elevated anticipatory cortisol might increase catabolic activity, bear with me here, catabolic activity, impair recovery processes, heighten fatigue, and potentially reduce performance readiness over time. In simpler terms, the body may spend more time stuck in this stressed, breakdown oriented state instead of fully recovering and rebuilding between the training sessions. Over time, that can leave athletes feeling more fatigued and entering practices or games less physiologically prepared before they even begin. So, what this intervention may have done was improve the athlete's baseline regulatory state before performance rather than simply just boosting performance directly. So, again, this becomes more of a bodily systems discussion. The athletes weren't just sleeping longer, their physiological starting point just changed a little bit. This is probably one of the most practically useful takeaways from this entire bit of research because athletes often think about performance almost entirely in terms of output or effort, intensity, training volume, motivation. But this paper kind of inadvertently maybe keeps nudging towards this different idea that the condition of the organism matters too. What physical or mental state does the athlete enter training in? What physical or mental state does the athlete enter competition in? What physical or mental state does the nervous system exist in before the first rep or the sprint or the shift even begins? Those things might influence adaptation and performance a lot more than athletes probably realize. The female findings stood out here again as well. The reductions in anticipatory cortisol were especially pronounced in the women, which lines up with some of the earlier discussions in the paper around the sex differences in sleep regulation, stress responses, and hormonal interactions. Again, the authors stay careful and cautious here with these findings. They're not claiming that women are universally more stressed or universally more responsive to sleep interventions. I think instead they're suggesting that sleep and stress regulation and hormonal responses and performance may interact somewhat differently across the sexes. And that's likely an idea just requiring a lot more research going forward. Wrapping up this article now, sleep is not just the thing that athletes do once everything else in their day is finished. It's actually better to think about sleep as another part of your performance environment where adaptation itself is actually taking place. The training session creates the stimulus, the workout creates the disruption, and the game creates the stress. But the body still has to respond to all of that afterwards, too. This paper suggests that even relatively small improvements, done consistently though, in sleep behavior may meaningfully influence the condition that the athletes bring into the next session. And again, this isn't through some magic recovery hack or expensive tech or just grinding harder, this grinder hustle culture, none of that stuff. This is again through intentionally shaping your recovery environment. I'll just end with this. It's maybe the strangest irony of sleep and sport performance. To be a little bit poetic about it, some of the most important performance processes an athlete will ever experience happen during periods where, from the outside, it looks like they're doing absolutely nothing at all. That does it for this week's paper. Episodes are uploaded every Thursday morning at 6 a.m. Mountain Standard Time on whatever podcast platform you choose to listen to, as well as the YouTube channel, Cortex Goaltender Development. Just a note going forward that once I hit episode 25, which will be the next episode, I am planning to take a bit of a step back and just take a little bit of a break. Not to shut this down totally, but probably 4 weeks off or so. 25 episodes just seem like a good ending spot for season 1, and I'll make some adjustments and kind of go back and see if I can improve this at all and hit the ground running for season 2. If you would like to support the show, which is currently a one-man operation and does have some costs involved, you can head over to patreon.com/Cortex Athletic Review. There's a couple of different tiers of support that you can choose from there. And again, during the time off is going to be a period where I build up that infrastructure a little bit more. If you'd like to reach out, there's contact information in the description or the show notes, depending on where you're watching or listening. I hope this information was useful or interesting in some way. Thank you very much for listening. My name is Evan Carrillo. This is the Cortex Athletic Review. Stay out of your own way.